Welcome to the Magic in the Cloud podcast, where exceptional visionaries reveal the personal journeys behind their remarkable success. This is a conversation with leaders who've transformed industries by navigating pivotal moments, making bold decisions, and cultivating extraordinary teams. We explore the turning points that define their careers, those instances where intuition met strategy and everything changed. It's an intimate look at the leadership philosophies that drive revolutionary outcomes, with cloud solutions as the quiet enabler. Here are your hosts, Joseph Griffith and Ryan Golombeski.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Magic in the Cloud. My guest today, man, this guy's got a crazy story. He grew up in Venezuela, loved baseball, not just watching it though, but analyzing it. He was a big Moneyball guy in high school, and he used to collect advanced stats around the game, all data-driven type things. And that led him to want to become a sports journalist through grad school in Chicago and into digital marketing, where he realized that most marketers can talk a good game, but very, very few use data to support their insights. He built an agency to close that gap. He's earned Inc. 5000 recognition, 3 years running? And he has a team where half the people on his team are STEM grads. Pretty crazy, man. He serves B2B companies, and he has that nice sweet spot between those who need something a little bit more, than what a startup might need, and those who maybe are just, too lean to be able to afford enterprise type budgets. And he actually can tie marketing back to revenue generation. What an awesome background. Welcome to the show, Mr. Carlos Corredor.
Hey, Joe. Wow. I appreciate that intro. I've been in a few podcasts, but that's the best intro, that I've had. The one that I like the most, tying everything, in my background.
Yeah, it's a great story. I was so excited that you wanted to be a part of all this when we went through our original conversations. Looking forward to it, man. All right, so there's the story right there in the opening. You grow up in Venezuela. You're a Moneyball guy, baseball guy. You're building websites when you're a teenager. Talk to my audience about how you went from that and wanting to be a journalist to where you are today with the agency.
Yeah, so, it started with sports. I loved playing sports and watching them, going to the stadium, watching them TV, even listening on the radio. Back in the day, I would have a game on the radio, a game on TV, and my mom was like, oh, this kid is crazy, but that's how it started. What I played competitively was tennis, but I always was a big fan of both baseball and soccer. Venezuela is a big baseball fan. We just won the World Baseball Classic, It was here in Miami, so it's really exciting. And that was, I was really, my favorite players back in the day were Omar Vizquel, Andres Galarraga, that's the generation that I grew up when I was in middle school and in high school. And then, playing fantasy. And really, I got into journalism because number one, I wanted something that I could translate to the U.S. because I knew I could move to the U.S. eventually. And journalism and communications in general was a good one. But also because, it's like, oh, I'm going to be working in the stadiums, right? It's like, that's a dream.
Yeah, who wouldn't want to do that?
And I did that for a while. The Angels closer, he was playing winter ball, and he rejected me an interview after waiting for him 6 hours, and that was the last straw for me. And I said, okay, I'm not gonna be a journalist anymore. All right, I have better things to do than sitting on a parking lot for 6 hours waiting for a baseball player to,
Nice.
decide, if he feels like, answering a couple questions or not. I started, as you mentioned, building. Back in the day, there was you had to text a number. I had to pay for the text. I think it's like 50 cents or something to know the score of the game, right? Because you didn't have apps, you didn't have phones with internet yet, right? So then, obviously in the US was the first country that you had a very advanced in terms of internet connectivity, everything. But in Venezuela, you didn't have it, right? So I worked in a newspaper. It's like, hey, let's do a phone version of the website. Let's do fantasy games, right? And they didn't want to do any of that. And, after that incident with the K-Rod, I quit and I did my own thing. I didn't have much to say, but whatever I had, I built websites. That's how I started learning about SEO, about driving traffic, about having your own business. And that's how I got into digital marketing, into entrepreneurship, into everything. And then, I went to Chicago to learn more about it, to get a master's in digital marketing. I was living off of, I mean, as a student still, right? But living off of the couple of projects that I had still from Venezuela. And then the economy crashed. And then the currency exchange, it went from being 10 to 1 to 100 to 1. So whatever it was, like a couple $1,000 a month that I needed, now it's 200, So it's like, okay, I have to get a job here. So I got into the marketing world in the analytics department because that's really my background, right? But
Sure,
then now,
it makes sense. That's why they'd hire you. Yeah.
And they knew, right? It's like, you're starting marketing, but we know your numbers, right? And all of the marketers that we have here, as you mentioned, right? They're great storytellers, but not really data. They say they're data driven. They bring always a couple of numbers, but it's like that's not really predictive. That's not really true, right? You're not going to do anything. You're not going to change outcomes with the way you're using the numbers, right? Which obviously, when you're truly analytical and data driven, something you can do. So that's, how I got into marketing.
Yeah, that's a great story. And it really resonates with, I was talking to you about hanging out with some kids, college grads, just like you and I probably were, they're a little stressed out as to what their career is supposed to look like. There's a lot of people asking them, what are you going to do? Why are you going to do it and all that? And I think one of the big takeaways is, one, it's totally cool to pursue something you love. That's totally cool. Number two, that pursuit has to have a standard of living to it that meets or exceeds what you want, right? So like you said, maybe if they were paying you $1 million to sit in the parking lot and wait 6 hours, you might have hung in there a little longer, right? But two great lessons learned, especially for younger folks who they really is, I mean, I can see there's really a lot of pressure to say, what are you going to do with your life, right? And we just never know what those turns and twists are going to look like.
It's obviously the sexy jobs, it's tough, you have to be willing to not make money, especially at the beginning and maybe for a long time. When I went to Chicago, also my experience, because it was in the background, I did journalism for a year in Chicago, right? Where, for the Tribune, for the Latin American or Hispanic side of the Tribune.
Yeah,
going
man,
to
that's cool.
White Sox and Cubs games, but making $10 an hour, it's tough. And then it's like, okay, I want to get into analytics departments maybe as opposed to journalism. But then you have all of the Ivy Leaguers willing to do internships, work for free for 5-10 years to maybe get one of the 30 openings after 15 years to a general manager position. Like, you have to be willing to sacrifice a lot. Same thing as today. If you're a woman and you want to open a Pilates studio or yoga studio, you have to be clear that it's going to be a struggle and a hassle, and you're doing it for fun, not to make money, right? And I needed the money, especially after grad school, loans, and needing to be on my own in Chicago.
Yeah. So one of the things I think we and I have in common is you're more on the marketing side. I'm more on the sales side. We've talked about this, but marketing sales are often described as natural enemies inside a company. People want to create this friction. What do you think causes that? And what are the kind of things that you try and change when you engage with a client to get marketing and sales to be more collaborative?
Yeah, I think it has been a natural progression of each of the department's responsibilities, because, let's say 20 years ago, marketing was not responsible for growth at all, right? They just did some pretty designs and a website, right? And then somewhere along that time, they're like, okay, you have to now do the SEO, and why don't you do some Google Ads campaigns, and now ABM and everything, right? So I think some marketing departments have progressed on their mindset and how they perceive their responsibility faster than others. Whereas sales, from the moment that leads are coming from marketing, sales, they've always had the expectation that marketing has given them good leads, right? So I think that's where the misalignment comes from. And I think it's still the source of more, honestly, more problems than it should be, because I don't think it's not easy, but at the same time, I don't think it's that complicated to get those two teams and departments to align and to work as a team as opposed to being enemies, and I'm sure we can get into how to go about that, but I think that's the reason.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that we talked about prior is, for me as a sales guy who tries to measure everything, I think you nailed on it, which is in the past, marketing wasn't held accountable for attribution of revenue. And then sales assumed that every lead was awesome and the client was showing up 90% sold. And what I know, the thing that I tried to do with marketing was saying, hey, all your leads are good as long as you can tell me how sold they are when they show up. Are they 90% sold, 60% sold, or 20% sold? It's too much time I used to spend, having the wrong expectation of where the lead was in the process. And what I do best with marketing is understanding where they are by the time they get to me. And I know that's a big part of what you do. So in the opening, we also talked about it's not that you won't work with startups and it's not that you won't work with enterprise, but you've got this mid-market type segment that requires a little bit different approach than, say, the startups or the enterprises. And I guess the stereotype is the startups don't have any money and the enterprises have too much money and they sling it around all over the place and it's not coordinated and such. But what is it about that market that you play in? What is it about your approach that you feel resonates with those clients?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think when you're an SMB, as you mentioned, I think enterprise, we all understand that really they have a lot of money. They've tried a lot of things. They have big teams. They've done a lot of things, right? And I think the opposite is true. When you're an SMB, you have no other choice but to be scrappy, but to do things yourself, right? And however, I think the most challenging one is when you're right in the middle because you have a certain budget, you are growing, you have pressure to continue to grow, you are spending money, right? But at the same time, you cannot throw that money away, like enterprise do, right? So those type of companies, when I was working in Chicago in a couple of agencies, most agencies in the US, they really go after enterprise, right? That's, if the agency where I used to be, if the company was not spending $10 million a year in only Google ads, they wouldn't get them as a client because then let's say you charge anywhere from 10 to 20% of that, right? So if it's not $1 million a year, I'm not going to bother, right? So we did some projects that were like, for me, it was a lot of money. In Venezuela, I would charge $4,000 for a project, and it was money for me. And then in the US, it's like, oh no, we're only charging $50K for this project. I'm like, wow, it's a lot of money. But they would they would say, yeah, it's a small project. Don't pay too much attention. It's always like gated, mid-market clients and those type of projects. Where I was like, okay, and they would still see some value. We would still have some mid-market clients, but it's like they were definitely underserved and those agencies are not built for them. So I'm like, okay, if I build an agency with a team offshore aiming for these mid-market clients, I think there's a great opportunity here. So that's kind of the thought process behind it and the model behind it. And then obviously, that's, our first couple of clients then were there and we started gaining experience. And then I realized, the best practices or the advice that's out there that people follow, that's either for enterprise or for SMBs, but very few is for mid-market. So you have to have a really good eye on what advice you follow. And because always learning from your own mistakes is painful and costful. So, that's, the world that we grew in our agency in and where we've honed and focused in.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that you're talking about is recognizing who the right buyers are. And I know, you're a big fan of wanting to get to the VP of marketing or the chief marketing officer in your discussions, not someone more junior. And we all know that's not any disrespect, but where or how does the conversation break down if you start with somebody too junior in the organization?
Yeah. So for example, and that has happened to us or happened to us in the past, right? If you start selling, for example, selling yourself as an expert in our case, and let's talk about a marketing agency, right? To use it as an example, even though obviously our clients are more B2B service in general, but just so people get an idea, right? If I go out there and say, we're the best in launching cold email campaigns, right? People are going to see us as, let's say, HubSpot experts, right? Or MailChimp experts, right? And then they're going to naturally say, okay, we're going to attract the managers of that channel, right? But the CEO of the company, even the CMO, they'd see that as a tactic. They don't care, right? They don't want to talk about open rate. They just want to know what happened with those email campaigns. How did that impact our business, right? Did we get any new clients from it? How is that helping sales? Are we saving time from sales for that, right? So the email manager, he's going to talk about open rates, about subject lines and which subject line is better, and the email templates looking nice, right? And then, it's going to be very hard to then position yourself as the true growth partner, which is what we really want to be and where we really can be and where we can really add more value, right? So instead of, let's say, and that's why the team was really obsessed back in the day with, let's do a bunch of blog posts talking about best practices for open rates. I'm like, no, we don't want to be that agency, right? Let's talk about how we can help the CMO, right? Let's talk about how to measure the marketing impact on the business, right? Let's talk about how to shift budgets from one channel to another. So then, the CEO and the C-suite say, wow, marketing now is bringing something to the table that I hadn't seen before, right? So that's the logic behind it.
Yeah, and that's as you think about your growth and your the things that have been successful for you, that contributed to being named 3 years in a row to the Inc. 5000 for fastest growing companies, and that was all post COVID, right? That's all since COVID, right?
Yeah, I would say COVID delayed it a year or two because people got scared, with marketing investments during COVID. But then things, thankfully, they went quickly back up, in 2021.
Yeah. So here you are, you're building out the agency. It's post COVID. You feel confident about your target ICP. What other things have you done, would you say, differently in that 5 or 6 year window that you think other agencies missed out?
I think, trying to distance ourselves from even the name of an agency, although ultimately, we do use it because it's also very intuitive. But I think that's the thing, right? It's like we help you grow now. And sometimes we do things that are more for the sales team than for what's traditionally being called the marketing team, right? So always remembering that you are there to serve growth and not to be the best in whatever tactic or traditional marketing channel, people know, whether that's SEO or email marketing, as I mentioned, or even Google Ads, right? It's going beyond that and making sure that you are, that when you work in a project with somebody, that VP of marketing or that marketing leader, if it's a mid-market, a lot of times they don't have CMOs yet. So it's a VP of marketing, right?
Yep.
Or maybe if the company has a CMO, then the CMO, right? But making, talking to them, right? Even if, we're day to day, we're presenting and status meetings with managers or directors, making sure that, the leaders of that team, and if it's possible, the C-suite understands how we're helping and what we're trying to do. The times where we maintain great relationships with managers and directors, we're at the very first sign of a crisis, we're the first ones that get caught, right? Whereas, it's different when the VP of marketing or the CMO, when they have, when they have a vote for you, when they can, put your hands in the fire for you, that's different type of relationship and growth. So I would say know who your audience is and know that you're there to fuel growth and not get distracted by anything else other than that.
That's great insight. And part of behind the scenes that what makes you successful is being a data-driven agency. And I was fascinated as to how many folks in your team are STEM-oriented backgrounds. Tell my audience a little bit about what you look for in a STEM qualified person that could come work for your agency. Why is that so important?
Yes, because as we were mentioning, being data driven, there's a couple of problems. One that, it's not just using any number, right? If we go back to baseball, I think a very common mispractice or malpractice, something that I hate when I see it. But ironically, people find it really interesting and cool, right? Is when you see those stats like Mike Trout, this guy in September at night when there's a doubleheader, it's 6 for 10. So it's like, that doesn't mean anything, that's purely anecdotal. It's not predictive. It's purely coincidental, right? That doesn't mean that, he's going to bat 600 today. I mean, there's other things that are way more important, right? His contact rate recently, who's the other pitcher, right? If you want to see how Mike Trout is going to do tonight, I'll tell you the other 3 things that you have to look at, but those are definitely not the ones, right? Now, marketers are really great at coming up with these random, meaningless data points, right? And just because all of the agencies know today that they cannot say, oh, we're not data driven, we just go with our gut. They're all going to be fired, but they don't really know how to do it right. So because of that background, in baseball stats, we didn't get to talk about that, but I also participate in a company where we currently track advanced statistics for Venezuelan baseball prospects, where you use hero, kind of like the hero cameras, but more advanced. It's called Rapsodo and Trackman, right? And then we sell that to MLB, right? But anyway, not to deviate too much. too much on that, but like that's really using the right data to make the right decisions. And that's something that in marketing you rarely get to see. You don't have the expertise. And it's really people that know marketing and then they learn a few Excel formulas, right? But it's very rare that you see in a marketing agency somebody it's a data science, right? That they know Python, that they know SQL, that they know predictive analytics, that they can create predictive modeling, right? That you don't get to see that. And when we were a 2 people, 5 people company, we already had one person like that in our team because of that background and because of how we wanted to position ourselves. So, and even today, right? Like we look for engineers and this is a sad story because we took advantage. I mean, it's not our fault, the crisis in Venezuela, but we really took advantage of the crisis in Venezuela, right? So at one point, in our company, we had lawyers doing marketing, and still today, right? We had electrical,
No kidding.
mechanical engineers,
Wow.
data
So these are
scientists,
people
right?
that just needed a job.
Yeah, and it's still that way today, right?
Yeah.
We are a hallway, we are a window towards the most powerful economy in the world, which is the U.S.
Yeah.
economy, right?
Yep.
So people rather work in marketing, as an entry-level position with Condor than being, let's say, a lawyer or a mechanical engineer for a Venezuelan company. That's a reality. Hopefully that's changing. With the Maduro capture a couple months back, we see the light at the end of the tunnel. But that's the reality that we've been on there, and obviously something that we use it in our favor.
Yeah. So I mean, there were a lot of takeaways there, but the three things that stood out: number one, being, like you said, a hallway or a path to get into the greatest economy in the world is awesome, and I know we appreciate you do that. Number two is, I think what I heard is, hey, for anybody who might want to consider working for you, if you're a predictive analytics person, that doesn't exclude you from working for Condor, because you don't necessarily have to be a storyteller. You could work on that. If they know predictive analytics, yeah, you could teach them a little bit more how to be a storyteller, but you don't have to be both, which quite frankly is pretty hard to find anyway. And the third thing, and like I said, that stood out for me, which is this is all on stereotypes and all that, right? Except for certain pockets of the U.S., you and I both know Venezuela has a lot of talented players. And the root cause for that might be pathway, right? Which you mentioned earlier. I mean, I'm guessing if you're in Venezuela, someone's like, either you're going to do this or this or this. Otherwise, if you're an athlete, there's a pathway back to the U.S. or to what now could be kind of world fame.
Yeah.
So I got to guess that if I'm Major League Baseball, 30 years ago was easy. You send a scout down there and he or she finds the 5 people that stand out, right? Today, you probably show up and go, holy crap, man. Every one of these kids is amazing. I remember as a kid, as an 18-year-old, I went down to a Philadelphia Phillies tryout, and I was like all league this and all that and all-star. I was about 18 years old, and these were 14 to 19, and it was 165 people, and it was one of the most humbling experiences in my life. And even though there were only a handful of folks broke 7 seconds, I was one of them. I was pretty quick. When it came time for my arm and he said, junior college, go back to school, that was the end. And maybe 30, 40 years ago, you could do that in Venezuela, right? Just have a bunch of guys thumbnail you. But today, it's like, yo, man, I can only pick 10 to look at, but I've got 110 based upon my eye. How do you help me narrow that down? So anyway, thanks for the pathway and the opportunity. Thanks for the baseball insights. And lastly, hey, you don't have to be a storyteller to work for Condor if you know something about predictive analytics. Amazing, man. Hey, now the next part of your journey is you're building out your sales team, right? I think you said you're trying to build out an US-based sales function after you've been running it mostly by yourself. What's been a pleasant surprise and also what's been hard in trying to hand that off, trying to find, I know for me, I always feel like founderitis comes in. So what's been easier or hard about handing that off to somebody, knowing that you have certain expectations?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's something that it has been definitely challenging and a good challenge. And I like working it also because obviously it's my business, up, as you mentioned, last year, was when we had our first sales hire, and we started in 2018, right? So we were a little more worried about serving our own clients, and we grew up by referrals mostly, and by people that worked with us that switched companies, and then they called us. But now, we're just starting to have or to put together that sales team, right? So it's been a great one thing is to advise something to clients, and another thing is to write the check yourself for your own company and do it, right? Whether that's investing in paid media or hiring somebody or investing thousands of dollars in a particular technology or platform for the year, right? So that's what we've done. I like to think of ourselves as agile and scrappy and quick learners and risk takers, which I think are all very important when you are at our stage, because I don't think, even though our clients are mid-market, when I describe that as like companies that are, let's say, anywhere from 50 million in yearly revenue to 500 million in yearly revenue, we are at a couple million, right? So we are not near that. We're more an SMB than a mid-market, right? But because of our experience with the clients, we thankfully we can do things a little more sophisticated than other SMBs, and we have the team for it. But with all of that said, it's definitely not easy. We are looking for not small clients that pay you a couple $1,000s a month. We did that back in the day, and they were not gonna say easy to find, but easier to find that, let's say big, how in sales they're called big fish, which for us are, again, those mid-market companies that hire us as their agency of record
Yep.
and gives us, let's say 10% of their marketing budget and spend to manage all things for them, right? It's not easy to close a deal like that, where they have to pay you a couple $100,000 a year or more, right? So, we're still obviously, learning there. I'm not gonna say we resolved everything. I wish I could say it, but that's really the phase that where we're at. It took us longer than I would have liked. I think we're finally seeing some progress, because one thing that, even though we're scrappy, I think we made the mistake of, let's say, believing that you could go out to market without really having your positioning well defined. A little bit of what we were talking about earlier, that, selling yourself as an expert in all tactics and all channels of marketing, it doesn't necessarily work like that. So it took our time. We took our time, not because necessarily we wanted it, but just because that played out in really finding our audience and our messaging and the right problem for the right audience that we could solve better than anyone. And now we're finally seeing some results in better conversations, in better meetings. And I wanted to have more meetings than the ones I'm having, but at least, these are the right type of folks that we're getting. So we're definitely making some progress, but it's still a lot of challenges, I think, like everybody in our stage.
Yeah. And thanks for sharing that vulnerability there. I think a lot of folks, my listening audience, worry about that. I think, and by doing that, you help yourself, you share that with your teammates, you share that with your partners, people like me on the show. And to me, in the end, I think that solicits both authenticity and people who might want to help or be a part of it all. So thanks for that. And then the second thing is great to hear from a marketing guy that, getting your pitch down is important. It's kind of like, just because that's part of your expertise and you help clients do that doesn't mean you have your own house in order that way. And I think that one thing, I'm not a marketing guy, but I would tell you that every time I've had that discussion and I think I'm niched, they're like, nope, niche down more. And there's that tendency to think that I'm just going to isolate my market. And I don't remember the last time someone said, your vision, your ICP and all that is too niche. No way. You still almost always hear it's a little bit too broad. So thanks for sharing that. And I think you've done a great job. I know you've done a great job on this call of articulating, what that ideal client would look like. Let's shift gears a little bit and let's talk about you and your upbringing. So born in Venezuela, back and forth, college in the U.S., learning English in high school and going back and all that, economy and all that. Talk to me a little about your upbringing, your family, and as you were growing up, what one or two or three people influenced your life the most?
Yeah, I think my parents, as everybody, I think it's funny because my dad was an entrepreneur. He's an architect and building construction, and my mom, she's an interior designer, mostly working at home, but I think they had a great balance. And even though my dad was the entrepreneur, it's funny, because my mom is more or less I see her more as a risk taker, right? So, and I think that combination.
So your mom's the risk taker, even though your dad's the entrepreneur. Interesting.
Yeah. And she always pushed him, to take more risks. And I think that balance is really important, because also my dad was really good at landing or grounding the visions and the risk, right? And, deciding what was worth and no work. So I think that balance is really important. But I definitely think that my dad being an entrepreneur and my mom being a risk taker or pushing us to take risks, and believe and making sure that we believe in ourselves, that's really what because being an entrepreneur is not easy, right? Whether you're in your 20s or in your 40s, it's not easy to make a decision. I'd say, especially in the US, where you have a really great cushion, especially if you went to college, right? You'll be able, for the most part, you'll be able to get a job and make a good living, especially relative to the rest of the world, right? So it's very hard to give up on that and risk that for maybe making it, maybe not. So, that's something. And honestly, when I go to the States, it's also really, what's the word? You get frozen, a little bit paralyzed or intimidated is the word that I was looking for, because everything is built, there's a lot of competition for everything, so maybe in third world countries, there's more opportunity to go out and put up a restaurant, or you go out and put up a force to a marketing team that helps
just
sales.
putting in the hours and working harder
Right.
can propel you further than, say, in the U.S. That's like the starting blocks.
Exactly, stable stakes,
okay.
but you still have a lot of
table
competition.
stakes.
So you come here, it's a new country. You also have that belief. It's like everything is already invented in the U.S. They're 100 years behind. There's companies that do everything. There's competition for everything. So it's not easy to say, you know what, I'm just gonna go out and try and give it a try. So that risk-taking mindset that my mom installed in me and my brother and my sister, I think that was really important. Seeing it that it worked out for my dad as well, that you can do it, right? Because if they say it, but both of your dads are employed all their life, maybe subconsciously you say, yeah, I don't know. Well, they say that, but they didn't actually do it, right? So it's like, so I think seeing that, that's something that I would call out as the most important, I say, component of my upbringing.
I appreciate you sharing that, and I apologize. I don't know if you had mentioned do we still have both your parents with us?
Yes,
Here?
yes,
Okay.
they actually live here in South Florida.
Oh, they're both
Also.
South Florida. So
They moved up.
So the question is, what a great testimonial. Have you had a chance to tell your parents from time to time, thank you?
You know what? It's I've mentioned it, but I think you're right in what you're saying. Something that I can definitely do a better job of, and I'll try to make sure to share the podcast at least, and also tell him more often.
Share the podcast. Mom and Dad,
of that impact.
If anything, you got to see the opening. And by the way, I thank you guys at the end of the show. Kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. It's another story over a beer, But I did a talk back in college, and it was on why people like each other. And although things like similar looks, similar interests, there were a lot of other attributes that correlated to liking someone. The number one reason by far that people like each other is based on the degree to which, in other words, the correlation as to how much I like you directly correlates to how much I know you like me. So the more you tell your mom and dad you appreciate them, the more they'll feel appreciated.
Yeah.
So we say, hey, Carlos, I really appreciate your friendship. I appreciate you. You sit at the table like, I don't really know why, but I like that Joe guy. The more you know someone likes you is the number one variable that correlates. A lot of those other things matter. We both like sports. I don't live in Florida. My brother lives in Boca, but I love Florida. Those kind of things, letting somebody know that you actually like them is huge. So yeah, we should tell our influencers that once in a while. Hey, you have your own podcast aimed at mid-tier marketers. So what made you start the podcast? What's made you stick with it? And what other things have surprised you about the podcast? And remind me what the name of the show is.
Yeah, it's Tailwind Marketing. The concept of just you just have to work smarter, not harder, in a way, and then just hearing stories from people that have been successful doing marketing right and at helping companies drive growth. And that's the intention behind it. I started right after we were sure that our niche were, mid-market B2B services companies. And, we have a lot of tech services, but let's say in general, B2B services in the mid-market sector, creating a community around the people that are shaping that industry, that have experience there, that, as we talked before, that have been successful maneuvering that environment where you're not an SMB and you don't have enterprise budgets, but you do have pressure and you do have some money to work with, right? So that moving in that dynamic, So, and I started a couple years back, honestly. never aiming necessarily to have a massive audience or anything. That has never been the goal. The goal has been, let's really connect with folks that can geek out on that, and not geek out in the sense of getting really technical, but just simply sharing what's working and what they're seeing, to do their job right and to grow, help their companies grow. So that's really the story behind it, and it's been great. Ultimately, because actually I did have a podcast, a baseball podcast back in the day in Venezuela. Yeah, it was a little before its time. Internet was not great, especially on cell phones. So ultimately but we did record close to 500 episodes. Back in
Wow,
the
no
day,
kidding.
it was a fun.
Yeah.
That was my thesis in college, and then it became a real project, for it. So I did have experience recording podcasts, and honestly, it's just as fun because I keep it casual. It's just like our conversation today, Joe. We maybe deviate into subjects that are maybe not the core of, let's say, the podcast, but when you see that the guest is passionate about something that it truly cares, I think that transmits, and that people really, they prefer to hear those stories than, let's just, tell you the 10 best practices to grow or whatever. It's like, it needs to be natural. So, and I've made great connections and friends from the podcast, people that I've met then later when I travel to, Chicago, New York, whatever, and then we go grab a beer. So it takes time and effort, but I'm really glad that I decided to do it.
Yeah, and I'm a big fan of, at least in my life, it's worked out this way. If I lead with passion and authenticity, if there's money to be made, it usually follows. And I don't know that that's necessarily the best way to do things, but I know for me that's worked, because I struggled, because when I was younger, I was taught the opposite, which is come up with 10 ways to make the deal bigger, come up with 10 ways to close it faster, do what you got to do to get it done, and then worry about whether or not you like each other. Get started. And that just didn't work for me. And I was a tortoise, by the way. So I was like double edged, like, come on, dude. What the hell is your problem? But when the end of the year would come, or the end of that, whatever, it'd be like, hey, and number one here and number one there, it was me. And like, why do my management see me as counterintuitive to the process? Like, you don't do it right. And I'm like, I don't know, man. I just know, like what you said, I'm like, I work harder than the next guy. I raise my hand when I make a mistake. I look to build the relationships, and then when I sense there's a need that I could solve, yeah, I go after that. But that's the order in which I do it. And over the years too, even now, somebody will put me on an assignment and be like, hey, in the beginning, like, we like what you're doing. Then it's like, we expected more. And then all of a sudden it's like, what the hell are you doing? And then the end of the year comes like, oh, sorry, you're number one. I'm like, yeah, come on, man. And I don't know how to explain it, except that it just always works out better when you lead with, like you said, geeking out, like authenticity, like, it doesn't necessarily mean techie or anything. Hey, final question. I struggle is I think I have 5 more for you, but I think the one question I would like to ask, which is probably could be a little bit more sensitive, but you're the first person I've talked to since all the Venezuela conflict went down that actually lived there, family there, things like that. But what can you share about what the experience has been like these last 6 months since the capture and all that? And overall, what can you share? And I know, again, could be sensitive, but with what's going on, or do people see it as a good thing or a bad thing? Is everybody feel safer? Are they feeling stronger? The economy, like, can you share us a couple thoughts on what's really going on versus what we hear in the media?
No, definitely. And I think, I'll tell you how we Venezuelans are seeing it, right? Because I think that's probably the part that you haven't heard, and the part that people that listen to the podcast probably haven't heard, right? So, and again, because the reasons of why the U.S. got there and took out Maduro or not, I'll let you guys discuss that. I'll tell you, I'll limit myself to what's important for us Venezuelans. We have been living in a dictatorship for almost 30 years. 1998, Chavez got to power. Me and my family was doing great there. My dad left with nothing because of the Chavez regime. A lot of people left Venezuela with nothing. Professional people, families that were doing great, they left with nothing because of the socialist and communist regime, right? So we have all wanted to get rid of them. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to do it via democratic ways, because it hasn't been a democracy for a long time. Elections, they've been, rigged, and that hasn't been an alternative. They essentially they took power by force because of the military and with money from oil and drugs and all sorts of illegal businesses, and being friends with China and Iran, etc. So it's tough, right? I wish we could get rid of them via an election, and but that didn't happen, right? So when Maduro was captured, it was wow. It was great news. It was a big reason for celebration for everyone in Venezuela and everybody that left Venezuela. Now, that's not to say that everything was accomplished that night, but it was definitely the beginning of a transition where we see the light at the end of the tunnel, right? And you can now see that, right? For example, they started releasing some political prisoners, right? And now there are ways in which the money and the oil that Venezuela produces that it can bring benefits to the Venezuelan people, right? And now, for example, people can fly back. There are also direct flights back to Venezuela because now there is security in place. You're not gonna get nipped. That you shouldn't be. There's less of a risk than there was before. Now, there's a long way to go. There's definitely a long way to go. But in general, Venezuelans are optimistic, are cautiously optimistic, and we finally see the light at the end of the tunnel. Now, obviously, we wish everything would have changed overnight, that not only Maduro would be out, but that the rest of his crew that's still there would be out. Yeah, we would have loved to seen that. And it was it was kind of bittersweet to still see some people that were part of that corruption and that dictatorship still in power. But we also know, that's how life works. And, we just need to remind ourselves that we have to be patient and just continue to put pressure that the transition continues, right? And then the Venezuela's interests are still forefront in all of these decisions that are being made. And that's really, how Venezuelans are thinking.
Well, thank you for sharing that. A couple thoughts there. One, I see myself as a pretty well-rounded guy, but I do appreciate that. I take for granted sometimes what we have here. It's all I've ever known is democracy, right? It's all I've never known. So I complain about somebody being too loud of a protester or their point of view being a little bit too different from mine, not based in common sense. Like, these are the things I complain about, and nowhere near what I know that, Venezuelans went through. So thanks for sharing that. I think the other thing I want to tell you is I appreciate the candor about like where we are today, and there's still a lot to be done. And I know people that watch the show will appreciate that because we just don't get enough of that firsthand experience. Thanks for sharing something that's super sensitive. I appreciate being able to leverage the podcast to bring that up. Thanks, man.
Well, thank you, Joe, for giving me the opportunity to do that. It's something that I know that people don't know, right? They don't know what they don't know, and they not always get that chance. And I appreciate, for example, the friends that I know that reach out to me directly to hear my opinion about it, independent on their political views. And I love to have the opportunity to give them that perspective because obviously there's 30 million Venezuelans that are wanting to improve their standard of living. So I think it's important for as many people as possible to understand how we're feeling and our history and what we want.
I can't thank you enough for being on the show. It's been awesome. We've had a lot of people involved in bringing the two of us together. So a special shout out to all the folks that were involved in getting you and I connected. It's been a great conversation. Tell my audience where they can find you. LinkedIn, websites, contact info.
Yeah, so our website is condoragency.com. So Condor like the bird. And I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, so feel free to add me there, connect with me there as well, Carlos Corredor. And no, Joe, thank you for invitation. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I gotta give it to you for knowing how to, take it into areas where, we've come to some meaningful points of conversation, and I don't think that's common. There's a lot of podcasts today, but I don't feel I do those myself, and it's hard to get into those, sensitive topics, meaningful topics, deep topics that can really teach something new, hopefully, to the people that are listening.
Yeah, thanks, man. I appreciate that feedback. That's exactly why we started it. It would have been really easy to turn it into a commercial for something.
Yeah.
Both Ryan, who's been more behind the scenes, and myself, is some of the background. Just remind the audience before we wrap up. The company name Cloud 113 that sponsors the podcast. The original company name was 113. So it was really about 1 + 1 = 3. And as much as you had said earlier, like when you say it's not a commercial, but when you say you're a Salesforce systems integrator, that's techie. And that's not even close to why we're successful. No disrespect to the technical stuff that we do, but the real special is, one-in-one, right? You have a lot of experience. You've done this before. You worked in this vertical. We have a methodology. That's one-in-one. But how do you get to 3, right? How do you get to a client who says, wow, this is way more than I expected? And Ryan and I were like, yeah, man, I don't care where these people do it. We need to go find out what that special sauce is. How do you get to 3 from 1 + 1? And you certainly, we were able to, with enthusiasm and passion, and articulate that today. So thanks again. It was awesome. I really appreciate you being on the show, Carlos.
Thank you, Joe. Right back at you, man.
Yeah, this brings us to the end of another episode, and an awesome episode, man. Look forward to maybe, getting another conversation or two down the road. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you on the next show.
Magic in the Cloud podcast requires more than a conversation. It takes action, research, and collective wisdom. If today's episode resonated with you, we'd love to hear your insights. Join the conversation and help us shape the future together. We'll be back with more stories, strategies, and real-world solutions that are making a difference for everyone. In the meantime, be sure to subscribe, rate, write a review, and share it with someone you think would benefit from it too. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.